New York Times reported that the AIDS epidemic is not spreading just death, but despair, and a psychological attitude among gay men that invites even more death. More and more gay men in San Francisco, a city where nearly half the gay men have the HIV infection, are now deliberately practicing unprotected anal intercourse, and as a result of the unsafe behavior, the infection rate is increasing, the Times said. A survey reports that 1 out of every 3 gay men in San Francisco is engaging in unsafe sex, primarily anal intercourse without condoms. The answer seems to be psychology. Since virtually everyone in San Francisco, the gay capital of America, knows that anal intercourse without a condom spreads AIDS, Times explained. Complicating this latest dilemma is the fear of some gay leaders that the distribution of information about the resurgence of unsafe sex will support the argument of bigots, invite anti-gay violence, or create public hostility towards gays because they would be perceived as deliberately causing a disease that costs $100,000 per patient to treat. John Lauritsen, one of our guests on this program, writes in his new book, The AIDS War, quote, "To pretend that behavior of people with AIDS has nothing to do with their being sick is to kill with a false kindness." End of quote. To save lives, he writes, we must tell the truth about the real causes. Where is the fine line? How can you be objective without blaming the victim? And what is driving this despair among some gays that amounts to a new form of suicide? I'm Tony Brown. In a moment, the psychology of AIDS.
Tony Brown's Journal is brought to you by Pepsi and its bottlers. This program is a part of Pepsi-Cola's continuing support of your community's cultural, educational, and business interests.
Mr. John Lauritsen was a member of the New York Safer Sex Committee, and he is author of the new book, The AIDS War. Our other guest is Mr. Michael Ellner. Mr. Ellner is the president of HEAL, Health Education AIDS Liaison. He is a founding member of the International Association of Counselors and Therapists. Gentlemen, welcome to our program. I'd like to ask you, first of all, Mr. Lauritsen, since I have read your book and interviewed you on a number of occasions, what do you make of the story in the New York Times with regard to the resurgence of HIV infections in San Francisco?
Well, I think the story is misleading because I don't think that HIV is the cause of AIDS, and I don't think HIV is harmful. On the other hand, there are real reasons to be concerned here. Basically, we have to ask, what is AIDS? And my answer, as I've said before, is that it's a phony construct. The idea that AIDS is really one of 29 old indicator diseases, plus presumed or real antibodies to HIV, a retrovirus, which in my opinion is probably harmless. But the 29 old indicator diseases all have causes other than HIV, and they really have nothing in common. Some of them are caused by bacteria, some by viruses, some by heredity, some by toxins, all kinds of things, some by malnutrition. And to say that they all hold together in something called AIDS and that it's all caused by HIV, I think is incredible. But in fact, people really are sick. And if we keep the definition of AIDS consistent, the definition the CDC had before 1987, so-called AIDS clearly peaked in the year 1988, and it's been going down ever since then. But they've revised the definition again and again, which makes the numbers go up. So it's now possible for somebody to be defined as having AIDS, and the person has no symptoms at all, which is very strange indeed. But I think the real reason that gay men, let's just talk about gay men for a while, are getting sick in ways that are called AIDS or diagnosed as AIDS, have to do with 3 major areas of risks. One being drugs, recreational drugs which were used by the very small subset of gay men. They're getting sick in ways that are called AIDS. A second area would be repeated cases of venereal diseases treated with antibiotics. And the antibiotics may very well be as dangerous in the long term as the diseases themselves were. And the third area, which you mentioned, are psychological factors. In every case, the Public Health Service and the mainstream AIDS organizations have been criminally negligent in giving false information as to what gay men and other people should do to avoid getting sick in ways that are called AIDS. They have given disinformation repeatedly. They have downplayed the dangers of drugs to the extent that they give intravenous drug users the impression that it's all right to continue shooting up with heroin as long as the needle is clean. Gay men have been told by the Public Health Service that some of the more popular gay drugs, like poppers or the nitrite inhalants, are perfectly safe and that they have nothing to do with AIDS. In fact, the evidence is very strong that they do have a lot to do with it. But the whole thing is confused. All of the official risk reduction information put out by all of the leading AIDS organizations and the Public Health Service deal with avoiding infection with HIV, and there is an obsession with condoms. Condoms are the panacea for safe sex and for risk reduction. Well, what can condoms do? I mean, they break a lot. Condoms are somewhat effective in preventing pregnancy and somewhat effective in preventing venereal diseases like gonorrhea. But that's all you can say. As far as preventing the illnesses that are diagnosed as AIDS, I think condoms probably have very little, if any, effectiveness.
Well, let me ask you this. You say in your book that there is nothing wrong with heterosexual anal sex. Am I right?
No, I didn't say that, but on the other hand,
I thought you gave a historical scenario in here, going back to ancient times where there has been historical sex between men. Am I misreading this?
Well, more or less. Basically, I think that sex between healthy individuals is a good thing.
Of the same sex?
Of either the same sex or opposite sex.
No, I'm not trying to trap you. I'm just trying to get to where you're going. Well, if that's true, then why is anal sex between men without a condom considered unsafe?
Well, it's considered unsafe by the establishment because they believe that you can transmit HIV that way. Now, even this is kind of dubious because there have been studies of semen of people who have full-blown AIDS, and using the polymerase chain reaction test, which is incredibly sensitive. It's like finding a needle in a haystack. It can identify one single virus out of 1 million cells, and a latent virus at that. They found that in almost all cases, it was impossible to detect any HIV whatsoever in the semen.
But do you place any value protecting the diseases that you say aren't AIDS, but you are saying these people are sick? People that traditionally are diagnosed as AIDS, these people are sick. Are you saying that the condom has no role, that would have had no role in protecting them at all?
Well, I would not come out against condoms, but I think the things far, far more important to warn people about are the danger of drugs. And in general, I subscribe to what's called the risk AIDS hypothesis, which was a phrase coined by Peter Duesberg. And this is to say that people who are diagnosed with so-called AIDS are really sick in a lot of different ways and for different reasons. And that what you should do is look at them and see what health risks there are that might explain they're getting sick. So in a sense, it's a very simple message. I'm saying that people should start thinking about the concept of health. And if anything is a health risks, and I would include even things like cigarettes, as well as drug abuse, a bad diet, whatever it might happen to be, people should be conscious of it and try to get these health risks out of their lives.
And that takes us right into Mr. Ellner, because this is precisely what you do. Now, let me ask you the question this way. Without debating whether or not HIV causes AIDS or not, let's just, for purposes of this conversation, assume that HIV is dangerous, because in the minds of the average man who is having unprotected anal sex, he is convinced, most of them, that HIV does cause AIDS. What is driving this behavior, Mr. Ellner, the behavior I described at the top of the program, in which a man thinks that HIV will give him AIDS and he will die, but persists in participating in unprotected anal intercourse?
I think in a way it's programming. The messages and the way they're sent out to people are such as 50% of you already have it, you're all as good as dead. There's also a reoccurrence of great homophobia. And you see don't ask, don't tell. You see violence against gays at all-time highs. And you begin to see that some people don't feel they're truly gay unless they're positive. It's almost like an identification kind of thing. Additionally, I think that what happens is there's an intense group pressure. The way the denial works is they put such an emphasis on not using sex or not having sex that people use drugs, and in that situation it's made to look okay, and that creates unsafe behaviors. The message is the needle is the danger, and I would say the drug is the danger, and this has been well established. In the same way, a number of drugs that clearly play a role in AIDS, like poppers, and John did some wonderful work on that, are being dismissed as a cause of AIDS or as a cause of being vulnerable to the diseases called AIDS. So it's almost as the subway ads. New York City ran a campaign and it said, AIDS is not worth dying for, or love is not worth dying for. Well, in our culture, love is worth dying for. It might be the only thing worth of dying for. Love of country, love of mate, love of family. Yet they're saying over and over again, it's not worth dying for. Maybe people get a different message when they read it. They immediately reject that information. What is worth dying for? And if they were just straightforward and said, unsafe sex is not worth dying for, the message might be much more meaningful and helpful.
Well, what is unsafe sex? Tell me what unsafe sex is in the gay community.
I would think it would have a violent atmosphere around it, be very, very brutalizing to the person, the receptive partner in this case. And I think another component would be volume, the number of partners. That anal sex in and of itself is isn't the danger, is if you have a number of exposures and continuous exposures and a lot of antigenic assaults on your health, that really is the danger rather than...
What's an antigenic assault?
Well, let's say syphilis, gonorrhea, herpes, CMV, chlamydia,
and then the antibiotics
yeast.
that you would take to treat those diseases.
So it's a vicious circle. Now, if you are having anal sex, I would think that in and of itself isn't whether it's safe or not.
Would you recommend the use of a condom in all situations?
If people have health risks, I certainly would say they're better off because the other diseases complicate the situation in a very dangerous way. So I would say yes, but then you have to assess your health risks. Not everyone is in the same situation.
Well, give me some categories for health risks.
Repeated bouts of venereal disease, long-term drug abuse, either medical drugs or street drugs.
You saw the report by the Centers for Disease Control on crack cocaine?
Yes.
Creating a higher incidence in women, and they've now admitted that that's also related as well as IV drug usage. I'm sorry to interrupt you, I just wanted to insert that one.
This brings up the question of the test itself. And the test itself has been challenged. Biotechnology, a very prestigious medical science journal, published an article evaluating the HIV test, the Western blot test, and they found that it was scientifically invalid. If that's the case, how can we discuss how many people are infected if we're using
the
a
Western
test?
blot test, for those looking, is what we call the AIDS test.
Well, there is no such thing as the AIDS test, but that's what they call it,
They
yes.
call that. And that test actually tests for what?
Well, it seems, according to this paper, that it's testing for antigenic stress, that there are many proteins that look like HIV.
Now break that down, antigenic stress. What does that mean?
An antigen is anything that produces antibodies, that our body produces a protection response to. So if you have a great assault and you're producing all these different antibodies, these people seem more vulnerable in this situation to opportunistic disease.
Now you mean if you have meningitis, hepatitis, syphilis, herpes, what we normally call these kinds of sexual transmitted diseases, then your body's under great stress.
Keep in mind, many of these people are being constantly reinfected. It's not a single event. It's a question where you're living at the doctor's office, where you're taking these medications on a continual chronic basis, and it's taking a number of years to get sick. I would guess that the average person showing up with AIDS illnesses has had 10 years as a process of becoming vulnerable to those diseases.
What percentage, either of you, what percentage of gay men have AIDS? Of the 10 million, 20 million, 30 million gay men in America, whatever the number is, what percentage has AIDS?
I would estimate that it's a very small part of 1%, because it's a part of the species is that males are attracted to each other, and there is a lot of sex between males going on and always has been.
No, but let's say that we have 20 million gay men in America.
Yeah.
Just arbitrary, I don't know if that's the number. What percentage, not numerical number, of that 20 million have AIDS?
Well, I don't have my calculator here. But
A guesstimate would be 10%.
Have AIDS.
Well, are at risk for AIDS or
I read a guesstimate which is closer to 2.5 or 3%.
Okay.
yeah, I would agree.
All right,
with
now
that.
let's assume it's 2.5 or 3%. Why is it, if it's 3%, why is it that 97% of gay men don't have AIDS?
I would say basically because they don't have the risks that really cause AIDS. But I'd like to go back to one point on the tests for HIV, which Michael raised. It's very important. The HIV part of the equation, indicator disease plus HIV equals AIDS, is usually done by tests for antibodies. The main one is called the ELISA test. It is very inaccurate, and usually the follow-through test is a Western blot, which was supposed to be more accurate. But still, this is only supposedly testing for antibodies. The Australian researchers found that, in fact, the test measures all kinds of other things. So if somebody's had the flu or been vaccinated for the flu, if they've ever had malaria, if they have a history of drug abuse, all kinds of things will make a positive score on the Western blot test. The only real gold standard for HIV infection is to cultivate the virus. And consistently, whenever they try to do it, in a majority of cases of people with full-blown AIDS, it is impossible to cultivate the virus. So they talk about HIV infection, but this merely means in almost every case that they have gotten a positive result on a test for antibodies.
Okay, if we can move away from the HIV hypothesis and deal with being sick, and you said that these men are sick. People with AIDS, whatever you call it, whatever caused it, these people are sick. And as you said, Mr. Larson, in your book, The AIDS War, people are dying. And what is important that we try to do something about that. I'd like to read this a short paragraph and get a reaction from either one of you. This is from you, Mr. Larson, from your book. And it says, under the headline, Why Are Gay Men Sick? The following profile fits most, if not necessarily all, gay men who have developed, quote, AIDS, which means you don't think it's AIDS. In the decade preceding their diagnosis, they contracted venereal diseases, VD many times, treated with even stronger doses of antibiotics. They took antibiotics prophylactically to avoid getting VD again. They drank too much. They used recreational drugs. They smoked heavily. They experienced terror owing to a war waged against gay men. They experienced loneliness, alienation, and depression. They experienced shame and self-hatred, which in a vicious circle, they acted out in ways that degraded themselves. You are giving a very heavy weight here to psychological dynamics that I have not seen before in any other place. How does the playing out of, according to your theory, of shame and self-hatred, how does that manifest itself in terms of becoming a threat of whatever this sickness or this illness is?
In a lot of ways. Apparently depression is considered endemic in the so-called gay community, and this alone can make people very sick. People with severe depression, there's a very high mortality rate just from this. But also, I think the type of low self-esteem, and basically the low self-esteem goes back to superstition, to the Holiness Code of Leviticus, which is 2,500 years ago, which basically said that men who have sex with each other should die. And this is a very heavy burden psychologically to bear.
Do gay men accept that as a fact?
It's very hard to escape from it. It's part of our culture. But
Why is that a part of your culture?
Because we live in a Judeo-Christian society.
Oh, our culture, you mean the entire country?
Exactly, and the taboo is a part of that. But I think what it leads to is self-destructive behavior often. And I think it's very interesting that the recovery groups, Alcoholics Anonymous and Narcotics Anonymous, have a triangle inside a circle. And the 3 points of the triangle stand for body, mind, and spirit. The idea is that alcoholism or drug abuse have these three components: body, mind, and spirit. And you can't separate them. They all go together, and to heal someone, it means, of course, they have to stop putting the poisons in their body, but they also have to heal body, mind, and spirit.
Mr. Ellner, what is your take on this paragraph in Mr. Lauritsen's book?
I think that he hits the nail on the head, but there's something else going on that's even bigger, and that is virtual AIDS. And virtual AIDS are people who are unfortunate enough to take the HIV antibody test, are told they're positive, and then they find themselves in a relentless situation of continuous terrorism. They lose their will to live. They lose their energy for a future. Then the advice by everybody is take drugs that will ultimately kill them. And there's nothing more painful than watching people who start out pretty much having a normal life and getting this result. He's talking about a very small group of people who are actually ill, what was originally called AIDS, a syndrome, a rare syndrome. And now the bigger picture is people running around in the terror of HIV testing who are now programmed psychologically to get sick and die, but even beyond that, the drugs, the treatment, the whole medical care of these people, in my opinion, is murdering them.
Now, in other words, the society, as you're saying, has created a milieu that is resulting in depression and low self-esteem in the gay community.
It's even beyond that. I think they're being programmed to get sick and die.
Tell me what you mean by program.
Okay, it's conditioning. You see, everywhere we turn, the information is always fatal, always fatal, always fatal. And if you read, what you find is even though a million times they say HIV and AIDS are not the same thing, they continually blur that line so that you cannot think of HIV and not think that you already have AIDS.
So in a city such as San Francisco, where 50% of the gay men have tested HIV positive, it is not, according to your theory, unlikely to have the result that we're now seeing. Is that what you're saying?
I think that is exactly the result we're seeing. It's high-tech phone pointing, psychological murder.
Mr. Lauritsen, there's a chapter in this book which I cannot read on the air because this is a family program.
Yes.
And it's pretty graphic in terms of the explicit sexual practices. You were one of the founders, or you worked very seriously with a group, the New York Safe Sex Commission. Why were you a part of that? What is your concept? Why are you concerned about the so-called concept among gays of safe sex?
Well, back in those days, in '83, we were the first group to formulate comprehensive risk reduction guidelines. And the guidelines were very different from those that came later, because even though much of it focused on an infectious agent, the premise of one, it also had other advice like don't use drugs, don't use poppers. But I was very concerned, even with what was known then, that people should be told what to do to reduce their risk. And this information is still not being given out 12 years later.
Now, poppers is now illegal, is it not?
Poppers?
It was legal then, but it's now illegal, am I right? Is there federal law against poppers now?
In the United
Amyl nitrites?
Yes, in the United States, but the poppers manufacturers have a new formulation which they believe circumvented it. No real effort has ever been made to enforce the law. It's the easiest thing in the world to buy them in New York City.
And it's used heavily in the gay community.
Yeah. Now, I just read a recently article on what is called crystal. Crystal means methamphetamine, and this is now the most fashionable drug in the gay disco scene in Los Angeles.
I want to ask you a question, and pardon my interruption, we'll have a minute and a half. If both of you are saying, and you are saying, that you identify, as your opinion, that drugs is really a larger player in what we are calling this illness called AIDS. Mm-hmm. Why is it that in the gay community there has not been a drugs equals AIDS education campaign? Why safe sex prevents AIDS education campaign?
It's partly because a multi-billion-dollar industry has grown up around HIV, and to have what I would say simply focusing on health risks and saying take care of yourself, there's no way in the world that this is compatible with the interests.
Mr. Ellner, short of that, what about saying don't use drugs is a good way to stay away from what they call AIDS?
I think the clients don't want to hear that message, and they're very aware. The people that are given this message don't want this message. They want a pharmaceutical solution. They're not looking to change their lives. What they're looking for is, give me a medicine so I can go back and do these behaviors. And I'm not talking about sexual behaviors. I'm talking about the ritual of the use of drugs.
The whole lifestyle.
Yes, and then again, it's much bigger, not a gay lifestyle,
No,
but
I don't
their
mean
lifestyle.
that. Right,
exactly.
Right. Sure, because we're not talking about gay people here. We're talking about a subset.
Yes.
As we would talk about a subset of blacks, a subset of women, a subset of Hispanics, and so forth.
And
we're talking about that lifestyle.
Yes, and the big confusion is the larger, greater gay community has bought into that they are at risk for AIDS. So you have many people who test negative but still have the terror. 5 years ago I did an unsafe thing and I must have it, the test is wrong. There is no release from the terrorism.
And I hate to interrupt you. Thank you so much for being with us. We're out of time.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.